She washed ashore at dawn, barefoot, breathless, and carrying more than just her unborn child. He was a man who'd given up on saving anyone, including himself. Neither knew that what began with a rescue would become the miracle that rewrote their lives forever. Before we dive into this unforgettable story of redemption, love, and the quiet power of kindness, if heartfelt stories like this speak to you, consider subscribing. Your support helps us share more tales that remind us all. Healing often begins where the world least expects it. Now let's begin. The tide had gone out, leaving behind a silver trail of foam and broken shells along the Oregon shoreline. Mist clung low to the sand, muffling the cries of distant gulls and softening the outlines of driftwood scattered like forgotten bones. The world felt paused, suspended between breath and exhale. Harlan Crow stood at the edge of the dunes, hands in the pockets of his weathered jacket, his breath forming faint clouds in the cold morning air. Beside him, a boy no older than 12 crouched in the wet sand, meticulously arranging a fan of clamshells by size and color. His name was Finian, but everyone called him Finn. He didn't speak much, didn't need to. Harlan had learned long ago that silence could say more than words ever could. This was their ritual. Morning walks by the sea before the tourists arrived, or the sun broke through the mist. Harlan liked it best this way. Quiet, predictable, safe. Until today. Finn suddenly froze, his hands hovering over the shell he was about to place. He pointed toward the shoreline, where the waves lapped against something tangled in seaweed and cloth. Harlan followed his gaze and narrowed his eyes. At first he thought it was driftwood, maybe a broken sail, or someone's lost tarp. But then he saw the outline of an arm, a pale hand, fingers curled slightly toward the sky. His body moved before his mind caught up. "Stay here," he barked, boots pounding across the sand. The woman lay face down, her dark hair soaked and fanned out like kelp around her head. Harlan rolled her gently onto her back. Her face was ghost-pale, lips tinged blue, and her body, God, she was pregnant. He pressed 2 fingers to her neck. A pulse. Faint. Fragile. But there. He scooped her into his arms. She was freezing. Water dripped from her clothes, soaking into his jacket. She was heavier than she looked. Pregnancy and seawater, both exacting their weight. But he pushed forward, boots grinding into wet sand, until he reached Finn. "Get the blankets from the truck," Harlan said. Finn didn't hesitate. He took off running toward the weather-beaten pickup parked at the edge of the trailhead. Harlan knelt, cradling the woman against his chest. Her breathing was shallow, but steadying. Her eyes fluttered, then opened just barely. She tried to speak. No words came, only a soft whimper, a tear slipping down the curve of her cheek. "I've got you," Harlan said, his voice more tender than he expected. "You're safe now." The drive back was silent, save for the soft clicking of Finn's worry beads in the back seat. The woman lay bundled in every blanket they had strapped in beside Harlan, her head lolling toward the window. She hadn't said a word, but he saw the questions in her eyes, half-formed, half-drowned. Back at the cabin, Harlan carried her inside and laid her on the old pull-out sofa near the fireplace. Finn lit the kindling without being asked. The room filled with warmth and wood smoke as Harlan knelt beside her again, brushing damp strands of hair from her forehead. "What's your name?" he asked gently. Her lips moved. A rasp. "Serafina. Serafina," he repeated softly, as if naming a newborn. "I'm Harlan. This is Finn. You washed up on the beach. Do you remember what happened?" She blinked slowly. Then her hand drifted to her swollen belly. They pushed me." The words hung in the air like a storm cloud, small, dark, and full of violence. Who, Harlan asked, her eyes filled with terror, but she clutched his arm with surprising strength. "Please don't let them find me. Please." Harlan looked at Finn. The boy was watching them both, intently, expression unreadable. But something in his gaze told Harlan what to do. "You're safe here," he said. "Whoever they are, they won't get through me." That night, as rain began to drum against the roof, Harlan sat alone by the fireplace, sipping lukewarm coffee. Serafina was asleep, her breathing steadier now. Her cheeks had regained a little color. Finn had insisted on sleeping on the floor near her, a blanket wrapped around him like armor. Harlan watched the two of them, the stranger and the son he'd rescued from wreckage years ago, and felt something stir in his chest. A memory, maybe. Or something even older. He rose quietly and stepped outside. The sea was dark now, invisible under the night sky, but he could hear it. The constant, ancient rhythm of the waves. How many lives had it taken? How many had it given back? He thought of the baby growing inside Serafina. Thought of her words, "They pushed me." Someone had tried to kill her. Kill her child. And yet, here she was. Alive. By his fire. Maybe it was chance. Or fate. Or maybe as he'd begun to believe in small doses, life sometimes sent the broken, back to the broken, not to be fixed, but to find what was left worth saving. Inside the fire crackled softly. Harlan took one last breath of the salt-kissed night and whispered into the wind. "Whatever brought her here, I won't waste it." By morning the storm had passed, leaving behind a wet hush that blanketed the forest and the sea. Drops clung to every pine needle, glistened along the edge of the cabin's tin roof, and tapped now and then against the window pane in a soft rhythm. Serafina Vale opened her eyes slowly. Her first breath was sharp, pulling air into lungs that felt bruised. The warmth wrapped around her was unfamiliar. So was the rough flannel blanket that smelled faintly of wood smoke and salt. Her body ached, her head throbbed, and her belly large, tight and strangely still, reminded her that she hadn't been dreaming. She turned her head. A young boy sat cross-legged on the wooden floor, a spiral notebook open in his lap. He wasn't drawing her. He wasn't even looking at her. But there was something about the way he sat, so still, so focused, that calmed the screaming in her chest. She shifted slightly. The boy looked up. Their eyes met. He didn't smile, didn't flinch, just stared, with the intense, quiet presence of someone who noticed everything, but rarely said a word. "You're safe," a voice said gently from across the room. Serafina startled. The man, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a flannel shirt tucked loosely into jeans, stood near the stove, stirring something in a dented pot. His hair was dark with silver streaks at the temples, his face weathered, but steady. He looked like the kind of man who fixed broken fences and didn't talk unless he meant it. "You remember anything?" he asked, setting the spoon down and walking slowly toward her. She tried to sit up but winced. "Take it easy," he said. "You hit the rocks hard, probably some bruised ribs. You're lucky to be alive." Alive. That word hit like a slap. Her hand flew to her stomach. The baby. "She's fine," he said calmly. Strong heartbeat. "I called a nurse I trust. She talked me through what to check for. You'll both need to see someone in person soon, but for now, she's hanging in there." Serafina exhaled, her hand still on her belly. For a long moment she didn't speak. Then in a whisper, "They tried to kill us." The man nodded, his jaw tightening slightly. "I'm Harlan," he said. Here's Finn." He glanced toward the boy who had gone back to drawing. "You already told me your name." "Serafina." She nodded slowly. "Where am I? Oregon coast. About 20 miles from Seaview. Closest neighbors 4 miles out." "You washed up near our trailhead?" Serafina closed her eyes. She remembered the yacht, the heated argument, The hand on her back, the jolt as she hit the water, the desperate flail toward the surface, and then nothing. "I can't go back," she said suddenly. "I won't." "You don't have to," Harlan replied. His voice was low, steady, like someone who knew what it meant to run from something you couldn't name, only feel. Later that morning, Harlan made oatmeal while Serafina slowly sipped tea, her hands trembling just slightly. She sat on the edge of the pull-out sofa, wrapped in a dry blanket, wearing one of Harlan's flannel shirts tied around her waist. It hung loose, oversized, but it was warm. Finn placed a small bowl of wild blueberries on the table beside her. He didn't say anything, just left them there and returned to his notebook. She watched him go, eyes moist. "He's your son?" she asked. Harlan stirred the pot. "Sort of. I took him in after the accident. He was 8. His folks didn't make it." Serafina swallowed. "He seems gentle." "He is. And smart. Sees more than most grown men ever will." She looked around. The cabin was modest handmade shelves lined with books, a chipped mug with pencils near the window, a thick quilt draped over the rocking chair. But it was more than a place. It felt safe. "I don't even know what day it is," she murmured. "Saturday," Harlan said. Serafina laughed softly. It was the first sound of lightness she'd made in days, and it startled her. "I'm supposed to be testifying in a hearing on Monday," she said. "Against my husband. I didn't get to file the final papers, but I had copies of everything in my bag." Harlan sat across from her. "There was no bag when I found you." She nodded slowly. "Of course not." There was a silence, not awkward, just deep. "He's powerful," she said. "Luther. He has people. Lawyers. Money. Control. And yet you're here," Harlan said evenly. "Alive. With that little girl still kicking inside you." Serafina's hand instinctively rested on her belly again. "I don't know what to do next. You don't have to know yet." She looked up, eyes meeting his. "Why are you helping me?" Harlan leaned back in the chair. "Because someone helped me once. Because I know what it's like to wake up and not recognize your life anymore. And because I didn't pull you from that water just to watch you drown on land." She blinked rapidly, biting her lip. Then slowly, deliberately, Finn walked over and handed her the drawing he'd been working on. It was rough, childlike, but beautiful in its own way. A woman on a beach surrounded by sea glass and waves, and in her arms a baby. She covered her mouth with one hand, the paper shaking in the other. "Thank you," she whispered. "Both of you." Harlan didn't say anything, but when Finn sat back down closer to her this time, and Serafina reached over to gently touch his hair, something shifted in the cabin. Not much. Just enough. The following days unfolded like pages in a slow, quiet novel, each one edged in mist silence and small acts of grace. Serafina spent most of her time near the window seat, legs curled beneath her hands, always resting on her belly, as though to anchor herself to something real. Outside, the Oregon coast remained wild and indifferent. The sea continued to breathe in and out, dragging driftwood up and down the shore, like a mother rocking her restless child. Harlan kept himself busy chopping firewood, checking crab traps, tending the small vegetable patch out back. He spoke little, but with intention, and when he did speak, he looked her in the eye, not around or through her. That was new and grounding. Finian as ever hovered on the periphery, never intrusive, never absent. His presence felt like sunlight through fog, gentle but steady. Every morning he set out on his own walk to collect shells or smooth stones. Every afternoon he returned with something carefully chosen and placed it beside Serafina's teacup without a word. The first was a piece of driftwood shaped like a heart, then a sand dollar, Then a feather so soft and white she thought it had come from a dream. One morning, after a night of strange, half-submerged dreams, Serafina stepped into the kitchen and found Finn sitting at the table drawing again. The cabin was quiet, the fire low, the air crisp with pine and sea salt. She poured herself tea and sat across from him. She didn't speak at first. Neither did he. But something had shifted in her. Maybe it was the baby kicking with renewed vigor that morning, or the first full night of sleep she'd had in weeks. Or maybe it was just the simple warmth of being in a place where no one asked her to explain herself. She looked down at his drawing. A lighthouse, stark against a stormy sky. "It's beautiful," she said softly. Finn didn't respond immediately. He added a streak of yellow near the top light from the tower, then handed her the pencil. "Your turn." She blinked, surprised. "I'm not an artist." He shrugged. "No rules." Something about the way he said it made her smile. She picked up the pencil and slowly shaded in the waves beneath the lighthouse, careful not to disrupt his lines. "No rules," she echoed. Later that day, Harlan returned from the local post office with supplies, canned goods, dry firewood, and an old box of maternity clothes someone from the town church had dropped off. He handed them to her without comment, but she noticed the way he lingered by the doorway, as though unsure whether to step in or step out. "I could have gone with you," Serafina offered, sensing the hesitation. He shook his head. "Not yet. Word travels fast around here." She looked down. "You think he's looking for me?" Harlan nodded. "I think he's always looking. Men like Luther Vale don't just let go. Especially not when they think you're carrying something that belongs to them." Her hand instinctively went to her belly again. Not from fear this time, but protectiveness. "He doesn't get to decide who she belongs to," she whispered. Harlan's gaze softened. He set the supplies down, then pulled out something else from his coat pocket, a small wrapped bundle of dried lavender. "For your pillow," he said. "Might help you sleep." Serafina stared at it, then at him. "You're not what I expected." "Neither are you," he replied, and disappeared outside with the empty crates. That evening, while Finn read a weathered copy of Island of the Blue Dolphins by the fire, Serafina sat knitting a skill she hadn't touched in years, but suddenly remembered with her hands. The needles clicked gently in rhythm with the popping firewood. Every so often she glanced at Harlan, who was sanding down an old rocking chair on the porch. "How long have you been out here?" she asked. 7 years. Why, he didn't answer right away. Noise got too loud, he said finally. The world, myself, needed a place where I could hear the ocean think again. She smiled faintly. Did it help some days? A pause. Then he added, "The rest I learned to live with." That night, as Serafina tucked the lavender sachet beneath her pillow and climbed into bed, the baby stirred 3 firm kicks in succession. She placed both hands on her belly and whispered, "You're safe, I promise." And for the first time since she'd boarded that cursed yacht, she believed it. In the morning, Harlan found her outside on the porch, sitting in the newly sanded rocking chair, wrapped in a wool blanket sipping tea. She didn't look broken or lost anymore. She looked waiting. "For what it's worth," he said, leaning on the railing beside her, "you're good for this place." She looked up, surprised. "What makes you say that Finn laughed yesterday?" "When you dropped that ladle in the stew pot." Her eyes widened. He laughed. Harlan nodded. Hadn't heard that sound in 2 years. They sat in silence for a while, watching the sea. The waves came in and went out. The morning sun filtered through the trees, warm and golden. Serafina rocked gently, her eyes closed, the cup of tea warm in her hands. And the mist, for once, lifted early. The wind changed that morning. It wasn't dramatic, not the kind that toppled trees or sent waves clawing at the shoreline. It was quieter than that. A shift in the air. A current that stirred pine needles and set the chimes above the porch into a soft, uneasy song. Harlan noticed it first. He stood near the woodshed, axe in hand, mid-swing, when the chill swept across his shoulders. He paused, eyes narrowing toward the trail that led to the main road. Nothing but trees and silence, but something in his gut whispered, "Not for long." Back inside, Serafina hummed softly while folding baby clothes donations from the town's charity bin. Tiny socks, pastel onesies, soft flannel blankets. Finn sat beside her, methodically organizing everything by color, then size. The boy had become her quiet shadow, not intrusive, just present, like grace itself. The door creaked open, and Harlan stepped in, wiping his hands on a rag. His face was unreadable, but she noticed the stiffness in his shoulders. "Everything okay?" she asked. He nodded. "Storm coming." She tilted her head. "I thought the weather looked clear." "Not that kind of storm." Serafina froze. She saw it then, something dark, threading behind his eyes. It wasn't the ocean he was worried about. It was the past. And the men who knew how to weaponize silence. That afternoon, Harlan made the rare choice to drive into Seaview for supplies. He didn't want to, but he needed to check the mail and pick up medication the nurse had arranged for Serafina. "You sure?" she asked, her voice low, as he packed a duffel with canned goods and propane cartridges. He looked at her. "Can't hide forever. Besides, people will ask fewer questions if I keep up my routine." She stepped closer. "Be careful." He gave a nod, then paused. "If anything happens, anything at all, you take Finn and the emergency bag and go straight into the tree line. There's a small path behind the garden. It leads to the old ranger station. You remember where the key is?" She nodded, throat tight. Harlan looked between her and Finn. "I'll be back before dusk." He wasn't lying, but he wasn't entirely sure either. The town of Seaview was, as he remembered, quiet, weathered and suspicious of strangers, but loyal to its own. The clerk at the general store gave him a polite nod. The postmaster handed over a small stack of mail, mostly ads and bills. But it was the envelope at the bottom that made him pause. No return address. Elegant handwriting. He slipped it into his jacket without reading it, and finished his errands in silence. On the way back, he took the long road home through the dense thickets, the backlogging trails only locals used. He needed time to think, time to breathe, time to prepare for what he feared was coming. Back at the cabin, dusk settled in like a heavy sigh. Serafina paced near the front windows, one hand resting on her belly, the other holding the cordless phone Harlan had left just in case. The shadows outside lengthened. Finn noticed her tension. He got up from the table, walked to the old phonograph, and placed a worn vinyl onto the player. A gentle melody filled the room, strings and piano soft as falling snow. Serafina turned, surprised. "You like this music?" she asked. Finn shrugged. "It's calming." "It is," she agreed, letting the melody soften the sharp edges in her chest. Then headlights broke the tree line. She exhaled. But as the truck pulled up, her breath caught again. It wasn't Harlan's. The SUV was sleek black and out of place among the pines and gravel. The engine idled for a moment, before the driver stepped out, a tall man in a charcoal suit, expensive and dry despite the damp air. His hair was sharp, his movements sharper. He walked slowly toward the porch, a man not used to being denied. Serafina pulled Finn behind her and opened the door just a crack. "Mrs. Vale," the man said, smiling without warmth. "You've been difficult to locate." She said nothing. "I'm not here to make a scene. Mr. Vale, your husband, would like to offer a compromise, a peaceful solution, one that ensures your comfort and safety, and the child's future." She held the door tighter. "You were reported lost at sea," the man continued. Your return will raise questions, headlines, court investigations. But if you sign a statement say you left voluntarily, Mr. Vale will ensure you're provided for. Generously. Finn's hand slipped into hers. She squeezed it tightly. I have nothing to say, she replied coldly. The man's smile thinned. He can make this very difficult for you. I've already survived difficult, she said. Tell him that. Then, without waiting, she shut the door and locked it. Harlan returned 20 minutes later. Serafina met him at the door, eyes blazing. They found me, she said. His jaw clenched. Who your guess is as good as mine. But they knew my name, knew I was here. He exhaled slowly. I'll handle it. How she demanded. They won't stop. Harlan's voice was even. Then we don't stop either. He walked to the fireplace, pulled a small lockbox from the mantel, and opened it. Inside were documents, maps, a burner phone, and a flash drive. She stared. You were planning to run. I was planning for this moment, he said. In case the past ever came looking. He handed her a key. Tomorrow I teach you the trail. If I'm not here, you go. Serafina held the key tightly in her hand, something steely rising in her chest. She looked toward Finn, who stood in the doorway watching them both. I'm not leaving without all of us, she said. Harlan gave a slow nod. The storm was here. But this time they would not be swept away. The rain came just after midnight. Not a drizzle, not a passing squall. This was a storm with a memory. Thunder rolled in from the Pacific like an ancient beast waking from slumber. Winds howled through the trees, bending pines like brittle reeds. Rain slammed against the windows and sheets, and the sea beyond the cliffs roared louder than any warning. Inside the cabin, the fireplace struggled to compete with the fury outside. Flames danced and flickered against shadows that stretched long across the floor. Harlan stood at the front door, one hand on the frame, his jaw set tight. His instincts, sharpened by years on the water, told him something was coming. But it wasn't from the storm. It was from within. Serafina gripped the edge of the table, her eyes wide, breath sharp. The first contraction had nearly dropped her to her knees. The second came 5 minutes later. Now they were closer. Heavier, unmistakable. It's happening, she whispered, voice trembling. Harlan turned to her, calm but focused. How far apart? Maybe 3, 4 minutes, she gasped. He didn't hesitate. He crossed the room gently but firmly, guiding her toward the pull-out bed near the fire. All right, we're doing this here. No hospital, she asked, pain in her voice, not just physical but fear. Roads are washed out. We'd never make it in time. You and I, we've got this. You've done this before. He hesitated for only a moment. Once. Years ago. It wasn't mine, but I helped. Serafina met his eyes, searching. Then she nodded, trusting him more than she trusted the storm, the world, or herself. Finn was already moving. Without being asked, he retrieved the emergency kit from under the cabinet, spread clean towels across the mattress, and placed a flashlight and bottled water within arm's reach. His hands were steady, his breathing even. Is this okay for him to see? Serafina asked between gasps. Harlan knelt beside her. He's seen worse, and right now he's doing what he does, staying present. Outside, lightning cracked the sky wide open. Inside, Serafina screamed. The labor was fast. Too fast. Her body had been through too much already. Trauma, salt water, emotional strain, and now it was hurtling toward the inevitable with terrifying momentum. I can't, she cried out as another contraction seized her. Yes, you can, Harlan said, voice steady, warm. You're not alone. I'm right here. Finn's right here. You are not alone. Tears streaked her face. Her hair clung to her forehead. Every nerve in her body was on fire. And still she pushed. Finn placed a damp cloth on her brow. She reached out blindly and took his hand. He didn't flinch, just nodded once as if to say, "You've got this." Another contraction, another push, and then a cry. Small, raw, alive. The sound filled the room like a hymn. Harlan lifted the baby, gently wrapped her in a warm towel, and handed her to Serafina, with hands that had once only known how to rescue, not deliver. But tonight, they had done both. "She's perfect," he said, his voice breaking for the first time. Serafina stared at the newborn on her chest, her hands trembling as she cradled the tiny body slick with life and light. The baby's eyes fluttered open for the briefest moment, and something ancient passed between them. "I didn't think we'd make it," Serafina whispered. "You did," Harlan said. "And now she's here." For a long while no one moved. The storm continued to rage outside, as if the world itself had paused to make way for something more sacred. In the dim firelight, the cabin had never felt warmer, never more like home. Then slowly, Harlan stood and walked to the window. Rain poured down in steady rivulets. He wiped the fog from the glass and scanned the edge of the forest. No headlights, no movement, but something gnawed at his gut. Not yet, he told himself. But soon, Serafina named her daughter Grace. She said it aloud as the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, soft, gold-tinged rays piercing the last of the storm clouds. It was a name she had carried in her heart for years, long before the yacht, before the betrayal, before the shoreline had nearly become her grave. "Grace," she whispered, kissing the baby's forehead. "Because she's the reason I lived when I should have drowned." Finn stood nearby, the same notebook in his hands. He carefully sketched the moment Serafina in the rocking chair, baby in her arms, the fire glowing behind her. He drew quietly, but with reverence. She's going to change everything, he said, not quite looking up. Serafina turned to him, eyes shining. "I think she already has." Later that morning, Harlan stepped outside to gather more firewood. The air was damp and clean, the world washed anew. He paused beside the trail leading to the ranger station, his gaze lingering on the curve of the path. He couldn't explain it, but he knew they weren't safe yet. The men behind Luther Vale wouldn't give up easily. Wealth had a long reach, and even though Luther hadn't shown up himself, the threat had already arrived once. It would again. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. But then he thought of Grace, of the way Serafina had clutched her, not in fear, but in triumph. He thought of Finn's calm, unwavering presence, of the way this broken boy had become a quiet guardian of something more whole than anyone had expected. And he thought of himself, not the man he was, or even the man he had hoped to be, but the man who had sat by a fire knees, muddy, catching new life in his calloused hands. He wasn't running this time. He was staying. That night, after Grace had drifted off in her sleep and Serafina lay beside her, with a soft smile of exhaustion, Harlan walked out to the porch. Finn followed. The two stood together, father and son, not by blood, but by bond, watching the moonlight dance over the wet earth. "She's strong," Finn said. Harlan nodded. "She gets it from her mother." "From you, too," Finn added quietly. Harlan looked down at the boy. For a moment he couldn't speak. Then he reached out and placed a steady hand on Finn's shoulder. "We protect this," he said. "Whatever it takes." And as the night deepened and the stars returned, Harlan knew that no matter what storms came next, they were no longer adrift. They were anchored by love, by fire, and by a child named Grace. The sun had barely lifted above the horizon when Harlan found the envelope. It was sitting on the porch steps, dry despite the morning dew placed with precision. Not dropped. Not windblown. Delivered. The handwriting was unmistakable. Sharp. Elegant, expensive. A name scrawled in ink across the front Serafina veil. Harlan's jaw clenched. He scanned the tree line. Nothing. Not even the softest rustle of branches. He opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a single page, typed. Formal. Deceit, wrapped in courtesy. Mrs. Vale, as a courtesy to our shared history, I offer you the opportunity to return quietly without scandal or legal obstruction. The child you carry while biologically mine need not suffer the consequences of your emotional instability and recent actions. If you decline this offer, be advised that I have the legal means to pursue full custody. Luther, no signature. Just the name. Clean. Icy. Harlan folded the letter slowly, walked inside, and set it on the kitchen table. Serafina was at the sink, gently washing Grace's bottles, the baby asleep in the sling, tied across her chest. She hummed softly a melody with no words. Finn sat on the floor, nearby, building a miniature lighthouse out of driftwood and buttons. Harlan didn't speak. He just slid the letter toward her. Serafina dried her hands and read in silence. Her face didn't change, not at first, but Harlan saw it, the faint trembling of her bottom lip, the tightening in her jaw, the way her hand protectively curled over Grace's tiny head. He's bluffing, she said, her voice steady but hoarse. He's reaching, Harlan replied. And men like that only reach when they feel control slipping. She looked at him. But he does have resources, lawyers, influence. I have you, he said simply. And now we've got something stronger than money or threats. We've got truth. Serafina exhaled slowly. Then maybe it's time we stop hiding. That afternoon she asked for the files, the ones Harlan had hidden in the lockbox months ago. Financial statements, medical records, photographs of bruises of documents torn in rage, of messages laced with subtle terror. I was going to take them to court, she told him. I had everything prepared. But I waited too long. I kept giving him one more chance, and he used everyone against me. Finn sat quietly nearby, listening. He didn't ask questions, but his eyes, those steady blue-gray eyes, missed nothing. Serafina looked at him. You know what it's like, don't you? When someone bigger than you decides your world for you, Finn nodded, then handed her a piece of paper. A sketch. It was Grace, but older, maybe 5 or 6. Standing tall arms stretched wide, her hair in the wind. Behind her, 2 silhouettes, one holding a hammer, the other a notebook. She'll have us, he said, and in that simple sentence, Serafina felt something shift. Not fear, not anxiety, conviction. The next day they drove into Seaview. Harlan didn't like it, but he knew it had to be done. Serafina wore one of the donated dresses, her hair pulled into a low braid. She looked neither broken nor theatrical, just strong, grounded. Grace slept in her arms, wrapped in a navy blue sling. The courthouse sat quiet at the edge of town. They didn't go inside, just dropped the envelope with the court clerk, a letter from Serafina, accompanied by copies of everything. Her statement, her refusal to disappear, her choice to stand up not just for herself, but for her daughter. When the clerk asked if she wanted protection, Serafina simply said, I already have it, and turned to smile at Harlan. Back at the cabin, life didn't return to normal. It evolved. Grace began to wake more, her cries sharp and insistent, her fingers wrapping around Finn's thumb with a grip that startled them all. Serafina sang to her old songs, lullabies, sometimes just the hum of her heart. Finn built Grace a cradle out of reclaimed pine. He carved her name into the side with a wood burner Harlan had kept in the shed. Serafina cried when she saw it, and Finn, without a word, placed a hand on her shoulder and left the room. Harlan fixed the leaking roof, reinforced the doors, taught Serafina how to shoot with the old revolver he kept locked away. She didn't like it, but she learned. Because some storms she now understood don't come with clouds. One evening while rocking Grace on the porch, Serafina turned to Harlan and said, "You saved my life." He shook his head. "You saved your own." "No," she said firmly. "You pulled me from the water. You gave me shelter. You gave me your trust." He looked at her, and for a moment the weight behind his eyes softened. "I didn't know what I was saving that day," he said. "But I know now." There was silence between them, comforting whole. She reached out and took his hand, and for the first time since the moment he'd found her on the sand, she leaned her head gently against his shoulder. That night, as the tide rolled in and the baby slept soundly between them, Serafina stood by the window and looked out at the moonlit sea. She no longer felt like a castaway. She felt claimed, not by a man, not by a place, but by the life she had chosen to reclaim with every breath, every bruise, every moment of courage that had led her here. And in the soft rustle of the waves, she thought she heard the echo of something older than pain. Something returning. Something whole. The seasons had begun their slow turn. September crept in with amber light and cooler mornings, brushing gold onto the tips of the pine needles and sending the first leaves drifting lazily toward the ground. The cabin, once a place of retreat, now pulsed with quiet life. Laughter wasn't loud, but it was there in the rhythm of the baby's breath, in the scratch of Finn's pencil, in the way Harlan and Serafina no longer avoided each other's gaze at the kitchen table. They had settled into a rhythm, one not dictated by fear or flight, but by family. A family not of blood, but of survival. And then one morning, the past returned softly, almost politely. Serafina found the necklace by accident. She had been organizing a small cedar box of baby things, Grace's first Booties the Hospital bracelet from the nurse Harlan had quietly arranged to come check on her weeks earlier, and Finn's carved driftwood whale, which now lived beside Grace's cradle like a tiny protector. She reached into the box for a folded quilt when something slid out and clinked softly against the wooden floor. Her breath caught. It was her mother's necklace. A delicate silver chain aged with time, holding a locket shaped like a seashell. She had worn it the day she married Luther. She had still been wearing it when he pushed her into the sea. Her hands shook as she picked it up. The clasp was bent. The chain kinked in places, but it was whole. Whole! She hadn't even realized it was missing until now. Somewhere between the fear and survival, she had let go of everything that wasn't essential. This had once been essential. A sound behind her made her turn. Harlan stood in the doorway, a mug of tea in one hand. He didn't speak at first, just looked at her with that quiet awareness he always carried, like a man who saw deeper than the surface. "You found it," he said. Her throat tightened. "You kept it." "It was tangled in your hair the day I pulled you from the shore. I took it off when I was drying you by the fire. Meant to give it back sooner, but..." He hesitated. "Didn't want to give you one more reminder. Not until you were ready." She looked down at the necklace in her palm. "I don't know if I'm ready now." "Doesn't matter," he said, walking to her. "It's yours. The story in it, good or bad, is still yours." She looked up. "I thought I had to leave everything behind to start over." He shook his head. "You don't have to erase your past to build a future. Just carry it differently." That night, after Grace had fallen asleep and Finn had retreated to his room, Serafina stepped out onto the porch, the locket now resting just below her collarbone. It was strange how something so small could feel like armor. Harlan joined her, holding a blanket which he draped gently over her shoulders without asking. They stood for a while, saying nothing. The sea whispered in the dark, a lullaby only those who had learned to listen could understand. "When you lost your wife," Serafina said quietly, "did you feel like you had to become someone else to survive it?" Harlan didn't look at her. He kept his gaze on the waves. "I didn't become someone else," he said. "I just stopped being myself. For a long time." She turned slightly. "And now," he let out a slow breath. "Now, I'm remembering who I used to be and deciding which parts are worth bringing back." She smiled, eyes moist. "I think you're more whole than you know." He glanced at her, then truly looked, and something passed between them. Not urgency, not longing. Something deeper. The steady hum of recognition. The next day, Serafina made tea in the early morning light. Grace was fussing in her cradle, and Finn was finishing a new drawing, this time of the cabin, with a fire in the hearth and 3 silhouettes framed by the windows. Harlan was splitting kindling out back when she stepped onto the porch, holding the necklace in her hand. "I want to wear it again," she said, her voice clear. "Not because I need to remember what happened, but because I survived it. And I want her Grace to know where we came from, but also how far we've come." Harlan nodded, "Then let it be a badge, not a chain." She smiled softly and placed the necklace around her neck. Later that afternoon, they drove into town again. Not to hide, not to disappear, to begin. They stopped by the courthouse to check on Serafina's filing. The clerk greeted her not as a victim, but with quiet respect. The paperwork had been processed, her statement now part of the official record. Harlan stood beside her the whole time, silent but solid. When she stepped out into the sunlight, she exhaled as though she'd been holding her breath for a decade. "Free," she whispered, and for once the word didn't feel like an escape. It felt like arrival. That evening, Serafina wrote a letter, not to Luther, not to a lawyer, to her daughter. "Grace, there will be things you won't remember about how you came into this world, how hard it was, how much we fought to keep you safe. But I hope you'll always know this. You were never a burden, never a mistake. You were the first real beginning I ever had. Love, Mom." She folded the letter and tucked it into the cedar box beside the quilt and the carved whale. Some things she now understood weren't meant to be discarded. They were meant to be kept, like a necklace from the sea, like a name whispered in the dark, like the love that grew not in lightning strikes or declarations, but in quiet mornings, rocking chairs, and the presence of those who chose to stay. By October, the air had sharpened, and the trees had taken fire. Amber and crimson leaves littered the trail to the bluff, crunching underfoot, as Harlan and Finn carried fresh-cut firewood toward the cabin. Behind them, the chimney puffed a thin ribbon of smoke into the crisp sky, the scent of pine and cedar mixing with the faint sweetness of cinnamon from Serafina's baking inside. Autumn had a way of drawing people inward. But in this place, this home, it didn't feel like retreat. It felt like settling, like choosing to stay. Harlan hadn't said it out loud, but he'd stopped counting the days since Serafina first arrived. She wasn't a guest anymore. She wasn't someone passing through. She belonged here just as much as the wind in the trees or the fire in the hearth. And every time he heard Grace's gurgling laugh or Finn's footsteps on the porch, the truth sank deeper into his bones. Inside, Serafina stirred a pot of apple butter while humming a lullaby that wasn't from any songbook, just a tune born from instinct, from contentment. Grace, now nearly 2 months old, sat propped in a cushioned basket near the kitchen window, batting clumsily at a felt mobile Finn had made from scraps of colored wool and buttons. She cooed happily at the floating fox and owl shapes, unaware that she had once been the center of a storm so violent it could have shattered a life. But it hadn't. It had shaped one. Serafina turned as the front door creaked open, and Harlan entered, arms full of wood cheeks red from the cold. She smiled, "You're early." "Finn's fault. He's become a slave driver," Harlan said, jerking a thumb behind him. Finn followed, carrying a smaller stack with quiet pride. "You say that like it's a bad thing," she teased. Harlan gave her a mock glare, then set the logs beside the fireplace. "You two planning a mutiny?" "No," Serafina said, stirring the pot. "Just building something that lasts." Her words hung in the air like the steam rising from the stove. He didn't reply, but his eyes lingered on her longer than usual, tracing the curve of her cheek, the way her hair caught the amber light, the locket resting just below her collarbone. Something about her felt permanent now, not in the way storms leave scars, but in the way roots find their place in earth that finally says, "Stay." That evening they sat together by the fire. No rush, no tasks, no looming threat. Finn worked on a new drawing, a family of foxes curled together under a tree. Grace slept, curled on Serafina's chest. Harlan sat in the rocking chair, whittling a small boat from driftwood. The only sound was the soft crackle of the fire and the quiet rhythm of life unfolding unforced. At one point, Serafina looked up and said, "Do you think she'll remember any of this?" Harlan paused his carving. "Maybe not with words, but in how she feels about the world, I think so." Finn nodded without looking up. Memories don't need pictures, just moments that stick. Serafina blinked back, the sting in her eyes. "Then I hope we give her a million moments like this." Over the next few weeks, the rhythm of their lives deepened. Serafina began writing again, something she hadn't done since college. Short essays at first, then longer reflections, stories from her childhood, lessons learned, letters to Grace tucked into a growing leather-bound journal. Harlan read them when she let him. He rarely said much, but once, after reading a piece called "The Day I Didn't Die," he folded the pages carefully and said, "You don't just write. You witness." It was the highest compliment she'd ever received. Finn blossomed in ways Serafina hadn't expected. His drawings became more intricate. He built a working weather vane for the cabin roof. He taught himself to bake biscuits. He spoke more, smiled more, especially when Grace laughed a sound that made even the birds pause in the trees. One afternoon, she found him showing Grace how to hold a crayon. The baby gurgled and flailed, drawing nothing but loops and lines. But Finn smiled like she'd painted a masterpiece. "You're good with her," Serafina said, kneeling beside them. "She listens," Finn replied simply. Serafina touched his shoulder gently. "So do you." He blushed, but didn't pull away. One quiet night after the dishes were done, and Grace had fallen asleep, Serafina stepped out onto the porch. The stars were sharp and endless. The wind had died down, and the sea sounded far away, almost shy. Harlan joined her hands in his pockets. She glanced at him. "You okay?" He nodded. "Just thinking?" "About," he hesitated, "how this started with a storm, and somehow ended with this." She smiled. "You think we're at the end?" He looked at her, then truly looked. "No," he said softly. "I think we're just beginning." She turned to him, fully heart-pounding, and without words he leaned in. It wasn't a kiss of passion or urgency. It was quiet, reverent, like two people who'd been walking toward each other across a field of fire and finally found the clearing. When they parted, Serafina rested her forehead against his. "So this is what safe feels like," he whispered. "No, this is what home feels like." Later that night, she added one more line to her journal. "Home isn't where we're from. It's where we become who we were meant to be." She closed the book, kissed Grace's forehead, and whispered a silent prayer, not for safety, not for answers, but for the strength to keep choosing this life again and again. Because now it was hers, and she was no longer surviving. She was living. The leaves had long since fallen. Snow dusted the coast now in December, light blanketing the world in silence, the kind that speaks only to those who remember what came before. The cabin still stood firm against the wind, its windows glowing amber with warmth. But everything inside had changed. Grace was no longer a baby. She was 18 now, tall with her mother's eyes and her father's steadiness. Not Luther's. Harlan's, the man who taught her to fish, to whittle, to look a person in the eye and mean what she said. She had her mother's voice, too gentle, certain, and slightly musical, as though everything she spoke carried a tune of truth. And now, for the first time in her life, she was stepping away from the place that had raised her. The invitation had come 6 weeks earlier. Northwest Pacific Leadership Forum. Keynote youth speaker, Grace Vale. The topic, building empathy into business, from silence to service. It wasn't just any event. It was hosted at the headquarters of Vale Global Industries, the very empire her biological father had built, then receded from as his health began to decline. The irony was not lost on any of them. Grace hadn't known what to say at first, but Serafina had. You don't owe them your story, her mother had said. But if you choose to tell it, make sure it's yours, not theirs. And so Grace had said yes. On the morning of the event, Harlan stood by the truck holding the door open for her, the same way he had since she was a little girl. Only now, the seat looked smaller, and her presence larger. You ready? He asked, trying to mask the emotion in his voice. Grace looked down at her tote filled with note cards, a flash drive, and the leather-bound journal Serafina had kept for her all those years. I think so, she said. I've been practicing since I was 6. You just didn't know. He chuckled softly. Oh, I knew. She looked up at him, eyes serious. I wouldn't be who I am without you. He gave her a long look. That's the point, Grace. You are who you are. We just tried to stay out of your way and give you roots. She hugged him tight, then got in the truck. The ride to the city was quiet, but not tense. Harlan drove, eyes steady on the road. Serafina sat beside him, fingers brushing Grace's from time to time as they passed around a thermos of tea. Finn had stayed behind minding the cabin. He'd waved her off that morning with a handmade paper star and a single word: shine. The building stood like a monument of steel and glass, its logo gleaming against the overcast sky. Inside the lobby was all clean lines and silence, except for the soft click of polished shoes and the low hum of distant conversations. Grace was ushered upstairs past portraits of executives and donors, names she'd never known, but who by blood were part of her story. The waiting room was quiet. She sat alone, hands folded, when a man entered, slowly leaning on a cane. He was older than she remembered from the few photos her mother had kept, thinner, pale. But the eyes, those sharp, assessing eyes, were unmistakable. Luther Vale. He paused when he saw her. Neither spoke. Then he walked closer and lowered himself into the chair opposite hers with effort and a quiet grunt. I thought you'd look more like me, he said, voice rough. Grace tilted her head. I don't. He gave a faint, wry smile. No, you don't. There was a long silence. I'm not here for you, she said gently. I'm here for the people listening out there, the ones who never had a cabin in the woods, or a Finn, or a mother who knew how to rise after drowning. I know, he said. That's why I asked to see you, before the speech, just once. She hesitated. Why, he reached slowly into the inner pocket of his coat and pulled out a worn, yellowed envelope. I wrote this a few weeks after the incident, he said. The day I realized I hadn't just lost my wife and child. I'd destroyed something in myself too. But I never sent it. Maybe I was too proud, or too afraid of what it would mean to admit I was the villain in someone's story. He handed her the letter. She didn't open it. "I don't need apologies," she said quietly. "I'm not offering one," he replied. "I just wanted you to know that I remember. I've remembered every day since." Grace looked at him for a long moment, then reached into her own bag and pulled out a small folded cloth. It was the corner of the blanket she'd been wrapped in as a newborn, faded, frayed at the edges. "My mother kept this," she said, "through everything, because even when the world tried to take everything from her, she still chose to believe there was something in me worth saving. Not because of who my father was, but because of who she wanted me to become." She placed the blanket on the table between them and stood. "I forgive you," she said, voice steady. "Not for you, but for me, because I won't carry your sins on my back. I have a life to live." He closed his eyes, and for the first time in years, something cracked in his silence. A sigh. A letting go. The auditorium was full. Grace stepped onto the stage, not as a daughter of a tycoon or a survivor of scandal, but as her mother's daughter, as Harlan's girl, as Finn's sister, as Grace. She adjusted the mic, paused, and began. "I was born into a storm, but storms are only temporary. What matters is what we build afterward. Some of us are raised by people who love us from the moment we breathe. Others find love waiting on a porch by the sea, in a hand that reaches out to pull you from the water. This is not a story of survival. It's a story of choosing to live." Snow fell that night. Grace stood at the window of the guest house provided by the forum organizers, watching flakes gather on the balcony railing. Below, the city glowed sterile and humming, a world away from the coastal cabin where her life had begun in truth, if not in name. The letter from Luther Vale sat on the desk behind her unopened. So did a second envelope hand-delivered after her speech by a sharply dressed assistant who spoke in murmurs and carried the scent of expensive regret. It contained an offer, legal papers, a statement of inheritance. According to the enclosed documents, Luther had altered his will just days before. Upon his death, Grace Vale would be the sole heir of his personal estate, including controlling shares of Vale Global Industries, estimated worth $180 million. She hadn't said a word when she read it, just stared at the signature, bold and final. A man trying to redeem himself with paper and signatures, with legacies written in zeros. Now she watched the snow, not as a girl stunned by a number, but as a woman trying to decide what it meant. In the morning, she called Harlan. He answered on the second ring, his voice groggy but steady. "Hey, kiddo. You up for a walk in the snow when I get back?" she asked softly. He chuckled. "Always." There was a pause. Then Grace said, "He left it all to me." The line went quiet. "I don't know what to do," she added. "You don't have to decide right away," Harlan said. "But whatever you choose, make sure it doesn't cost you more than it gives." Grace returned home the next day. The drive felt longer this time, like a pilgrimage. When the cabin finally came into view, roof dusted in snow, firewood stacked neatly by the porch, smoke curling from the chimney, her chest tightened. Finn ran out to meet her, slipping on the icy path and laughing when she caught him. Serafina waited at the doorway, arms crossed over her cardigan, eyes shining, and Harlan stood just behind her, hands in his jacket pockets, watching her the way he always had, not with possession, but with presence. She was home. That evening after dinner, Grace sat them all down by the fire. The papers were in her lap. She told them everything: the inheritance, the shares, the letter she still hadn't opened. He said he didn't want to be remembered as a villain. She said, voice even, that this was his way of making something right. Serafina was quiet, her hands folded in her lap. Her eyes were kind, but not surprised. "He's trying," she said. in the only language he ever knew. "I don't want his money," Grace said. "I don't want anything that feels like it was built on what he broke." Harlan looked at her. "But you could turn it into something better." Finn, who had been listening quietly, finally spoke. "Keep the part that matters." Grace tilted her head. "What do you mean?" He shrugged. "Don't keep the company, or the power. Keep the piece you can use to build something new." Serafina nodded. Maybe the best way to answer him isn't with a refusal. Maybe it's with a redirection. Grace looked down at the papers, then back at the faces around her. "I've been thinking," she said slowly, "about starting a foundation. Something lasting. For women like my mother. For kids like Finn. For families that begin in the middle of a storm and need a place to come ashore." Harlan smiled, soft and proud. "Sounds like something worth inheriting." She looked at him, her throat tight. "I only ever wanted to be who you raised me to be." He reached over and took her hand. "You already are." 2 weeks later, she stood again in the city. This time, not on a stage, in a lawyer's office. She signed the acceptance form, but attached an addendum the estate would be transferred to a new entity, the Waves of Grace Foundation, a nonprofit committed to supporting single-parent households, trauma recovery programs, and creative development for neurodiverse youth. She refused the corporate shares, refused the mansion in Aspen, refused the nameplate on the executive board, but she took the resources and gave them purpose. Back at the cabin, a small celebration bloomed in the living room, not with champagne or grandeur, but with hot cocoa and laughter and a new brass nameplate above the door that Finn had engraved himself. "This is where Grace lives." Serafina teared up when she saw it, not for the cleverness, but for the truth. It was where Grace lived, not just the girl, the idea, the miracle. That night, Grace finally opened Luther's letter. It wasn't long, just a few lines. "Grace, I won't pretend I deserve your forgiveness, but I hope I gave you something to build with. You were never mine in any real way, but I am proud of who you became. If nothing else, I'm glad I didn't stop that from happening. L." She folded it carefully and placed it inside the journal her mother had started for her all those years ago. Not because it was a treasure, but because it was a thread she had learned to hold without letting it pull her under. And as snow fell again that evening, Grace stepped out onto the porch, wrapped in a wool blanket. Harlan joined her. Serafina followed, cradling mugs of cider. Finn came last, carrying a small wooden box. "What's this?" Grace asked. He opened it. Inside was a model of their cabin, hand-carved, lit from within by a tiny bulb. The windows glowed. "It's for your office," he said. "Wherever that ends up being." She bent down, kissed the top of his head. "I think I already know where it'll be." Because Grace hadn't just inherited a name. She'd inherited a legacy. And this time, it would begin not with power or pride, but with love, with healing, and with the firelight of a home that had once pulled her mother from the sea. The first signs of spring came quietly. A pale crocus nudged through the thawing soil behind the woodshed. Birds returned with tentative songs. The sea softened. It no longer roared or whispered secrets. It breathed, steady, patient, as if finally at peace. The cabin, too, breathed, not with the frantic heartbeat of survival, but with the slow, full rhythm of life deeply rooted. It had become more than shelter, more than a backdrop to a miracle. It was as Finn had once carved into brass the place where Grace lived. Now it was preparing to let her go. Grace stood by the mirror in the front room, adjusting the simple linen collar of her dress. Light streamed in through the east-facing window, warming the pinewood floors, casting golden frames around the photograph, collages on the wall. Finn's sketches, Serafina's candid shots of baby Grace asleep in Harlan's arms, and one small, faded picture of a younger Harlan staring out at the ocean, lost in thought. The room smelled of lavender and lemon balm. A kettle whistled gently in the background. Serafina hummed as she buttoned the back of her daughter's dress, her fingers both confident and hesitant. "You know you don't have to go today," she said softly. "I do," Grace replied, voice calm. "But I'll come back. Always." Serafina didn't answer. She just pressed a kiss to the crown of Grace's head and stepped back, blinking quickly. From the porch, Finn called out, "It's time." They gathered beneath the old pine at the bluff, the one Harlan had planted with Finn when they first built the garden. Now tall and proud, it bore witness to every season the family had endured. A small group stood around a modest wooden platform, friends from town, volunteers from the foundation, neighbors who had once whispered, but now brought casseroles and stories and soft hugs. All had come to celebrate the official launch of the Waves of Grace Retreat, a coastal refuge for single parents and children healing from trauma. It was Grace's vision, but it had grown from the soil of everyone who had ever loved her. Harlan stood beside the podium in a clean flannel shirt, nervously fingering the edges of his speech. He hadn't written much, just a few bullet points on an index card. He didn't need more. Grace, he thought, had always said things better than he could. But today wasn't just hers. It belonged to them all. When he stepped up to the podium, the wind caught his voice for a second, then stilled, as if the sea had leaned in to listen. "I was never supposed to be a father," he began, "and I'm not Grace's by blood." But the first time I heard her cry in this very cabin, something inside me shifted. Not all at once. Not like lightning, but like wood warming beside a fire. He looked at her standing beneath the pine, her hands folded, her eyes misty. She didn't just grow up here. She grew us, every one of us. She taught us that being broken doesn't mean you're finished. It means you've got space for something new to grow. There were tears in the crowd now, some silent, some open. She took a name that once brought pain, he continued, and turned it into something that gives others a second chance. He looked down at his card, then away from it. And that's what this place is. A second chance. For anyone who's ever been pushed out, washed up, or left behind. The tide doesn't just take. Sometimes it gives back. He stepped down. No applause followed, just stillness. Then Grace walked up to the podium and smiled through her tears. She didn't speak from notes. She didn't need to. When my mother was pushed into the sea, she wasn't just escaping something. She was swimming towards something she hadn't met yet. A man with calloused hands and a quiet heart. A boy who listened better than most grown men. A cabin held together by love, not lumber. And from that storm, I was born. Not just in body, but in spirit. I was born into firewood crackling at night, into lullabies without lyrics, into the kind of love that shows up early and stays late and asks for nothing but truth. This place, this land was my rescue, and now it'll be someone else's. She didn't say more. She didn't need to. When she stepped down, Serafina embraced her first, holding her so tightly it felt like a promise. Then Finn, wordless as ever, placed a carved wooden key into her hand. Harlan simply nodded. But his eyes said everything. That evening they sat on the porch together, just the four of them like it used to be. The guests had gone. The sun was falling behind the waves, and the sky burned copper and rose. Grace sat on the top step barefoot, her head on Harlan's knee, like she had done as a child. "I'll come back every season," she murmured. "You'd better," he said, clearing his throat. "Finn made your room into a reading nook, but we can kick him out." Finn smirked. Serafina laughed. The fire inside crackled. The sea exhaled. As night settled in, Grace walked down to the shoreline alone. She stood where the waves kissed her toes, cold and bracing. She looked out at the horizon and whispered a thank you not to anyone in particular, but to the journey itself, to the salt, the waves, the woman her mother had been, the man her father had become, to the grace she had chosen to carry. Then she reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the seashell locket that had once belonged to her mother, then to her. She opened it. Inside a picture, Serafina smiling in the kitchen, and beside it, a dried sprig of lavender. She closed it gently and placed it around her neck. As she turned back toward the cabin, its windows glowing like memory, she whispered the words that had lived inside her since the very beginning. I was never lost. I was just waiting for the tide to turn. If this story touched your heart, we'd love to know where in the world are you watching from. Leave us a comment and share a little piece of your corner of the world. It's always a gift to see how far these stories travel. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this about love, kindness, second chances, and the quiet strength that carries us through, feel free to subscribe. We're building something gentle and meaningful here, one story at a time. Thank you truly for spending this time with us. Your presence means more than you know.